There are places in this world, forgotten and silent, where the past doesn't just linger, it breathes. They are the abandoned mills and the lonely mountain roads, where the air grows cold and a story waits to be told. A story that was never meant for the living. You're about to hear stories that blur the line between memory and nightmare. Enter the world of true horror stories and subscribe, but only if you're really not afraid. Seriously. The Cole Tipple alarm Dale Mathers had worked the night watch for 22 years and believed he had seen every trick that loneliness and shadow could play on a man's mind. His post at the Black Creek Coal Tipple in Kanawha County, West Virginia, was a testament to patience and the slow decay of American industry. The tipple itself was a skeletal giant, a cathedral of rust and silence looming against a sky bruised with the last light of evening. For a decade, the place had been inert, the power lines cut at the county road, the machinery seized by weather and neglect. Dale's job was simple, a formality for the insurance company, to patrol the perimeter fence and ensure no local kids were using the derelict structure for a dare. He sat in a small, insulated guard shack with a bank of low-resolution monitors, a thermos of black coffee, and a paperback novel. The silence was his constant companion, a physical presence broken only by the wind whistling through the girders or the distant cry of a fox. He knew the sounds of this place, the groans of cooling metal in the winter and the drip of condensation in the summer. It was a predictable, manageable world. That predictability shattered on a cold Tuesday in October of 2002. It was just after 2 in the morning when the sound ripped through the quiet. It was a klaxon, a deafening, industrial alarm that hadn't been heard in over a decade. Dale's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. He instinctively reached for the panel to kill the alarm, but his hand hovered over dead switches. There was no power. There was no circuit. There was no way for that sound to be happening. The alarm blared for a solid 30 seconds before cutting out, leaving a ringing void that was somehow more terrifying than the noise itself. His first thought, the rational one his mind clung to, was trespassers. It had to be kids, clever ones with a portable generator and a twisted sense of humor. He grabbed his heavy maglite and keyed the mic on his handheld radio, the signal bouncing to the county sheriff's dispatch. He reported a possible 1031, a trespass, keeping his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. He told dispatch he was going to review the tapes before approaching. Back in the shack, he rewound the digital feed from camera 7, the one pointed at the main conveyor belt that ran up the length of the tipple. The camera was on an independent battery backup, a small concession to modern security. The footage was grainy, washed out in the infrared night vision, but the timeline was clear. At 02:11 a.m., the conveyor belt, a massive ribbon of rubber and steel thick with a decade of rust, began to move. There was no sound on the tape, but he could imagine the shriek of protest from metal that had been fused by corrosion. It moved slowly at first, a shuddering, impossible motion, before picking up speed. It ran, empty and groaning, for exactly 6 minutes. Then, at 02:17 a.m., it simply stopped. Dale watched the loop 3 times, the coffee growing cold in his stomach. There were no kids, no generator visible, no vehicle lights. The machine was simply running on its own, powered by nothing. A deeper, more primal fear began to uncoil within him. This wasn't a prank. This was wrong. When the deputies arrived 40 minutes later, their headlights cutting through the oppressive dark, Dale met them at the gate. He tried to explain what he'd seen on the tape, but the words felt foolish coming out of his mouth. The two deputies, a veteran named Creasy and a younger man, exchanged a look of weary skepticism. They followed Dale up the gravel path to the base of the tipple. The air was still and cold, heavy with the smell of damp earth and rust. The massive conveyor belt loomed over them, a silent artery of decay. Dale pointed his flashlight at the belt. "It was running," he said, his voice quiet. "Right here. I've got it on video." Deputy Creasy ran his own light along the structure. He walked over and placed a hand on one of the huge rollers, then gave it a shove. It didn't budge. He put his shoulder into it, grunting with effort. The roller was a solid, unmoving mass of fused metal. He kicked it, and the sound was a dull thud, the sound of a boot hitting a rock. "Dale," Creasy said, his voice gentle but firm. "This thing hasn't moved in years. Look at it. The bearings are shot. The whole line is seized solid with rust. You'd need a cutting torch and a week's work just to get one of these rollers to turn, let alone the whole belt." Dale felt a wave of dizziness. He pulled out the small digital camera he'd used to record the monitor and showed them the footage. They watched the ghostly image of the belt moving, the timestamp glowing in the corner. The younger deputy stared from the screen to the rusted machine and back again, his mouth slightly agape. Creasy just shook his head slowly. "Glitches, Dale? Old wiring, battery backups? They can cause phantom images. It's a ghost in the machine, that's all." But it wasn't. Dale knew it wasn't. A glitch couldn't explain the alarm. A physical horn powered by wires that led nowhere. A glitch couldn't explain the feeling that was now crawling up his spine. The feeling of being watched by the vast, dark structure. He knew in that moment that for 6 minutes the tipple had been alive, performing a task for a master who was no longer there, or for one who had never left. He finished his shift in a state of quiet dread, the silence no longer a comfort, but a threat. Every groan of the metal was a whisper, every shadow a waiting figure. The next morning, he turned in his keys and his resignation. He never worked a night shift again. The official document, filed under a Kanawha County Sheriff Incident Report from October of 2002, lists the cause as an unidentified electrical surge and security system malfunction. But Dale knew what he saw. He knew that for 6 minutes, something long dead had woken up to do its work, and he understood that some places hold on to their purpose long after the men who built them are gone. The Skyline Drive static ranger Ben Carter considered Skyline Drive his sanctuary. For 7 years, he had patrolled the winding, scenic road that ribboned along the crest of the Blue Ridge Mountains in Shenandoah National Park. He knew every overlook, every trailhead, every dip and curve of the asphalt. He understood the moods of the mountains, the sudden fogs that could swallow the world, the crisp, clear nights when the stars felt close enough to touch. His patrol vehicle was his office, a rolling bastion of order in a world of wilderness. The steady crackle of the Park Service radio was the soundtrack to his life, a constant connection to his fellow rangers and the world beyond the peaks. It was a lifeline, a symbol of safety and communication in the isolated stretches of the park. In July of 1999, during a particularly hot and humid summer, that lifeline became a source of profound and unexplainable dread. Ben was on the late shift, patrolling the southern district of the park. The air was thick and heavy, and a low-lying haze blurred the distant valleys. It was a quiet night, the tourist traffic long gone, leaving the drive to the deer in the silence. Around 11:30 p.m., as he was rounding a curve near the Loft Mountain overlook, his radio crackled to life. It wasn't the clean, clear voice of dispatch. It was a burst of static, thick and layered, and underneath it, voices. They were distorted, panicked, overlapping in a chaotic jumble of sound. He adjusted the squelch, thinking it was atmospheric interference, a common occurrence in the mountains. But then, through the noise, he heard something that made the hairs on his arms stand up. A voice, thin and reedy, repeated a string of numbers. 437. It was his badge number. He keyed his mic. Dispatch, this is Ranger 437. I'm getting some unusual radio traffic. Can you confirm? The reply was immediate and clear. Negative 437. The channel is clear. No traffic logged. Ben sat in his truck, the engine humming quietly, and listened. The static burst came again, louder this time. More voices, frantic and unintelligible, and then again, the numbers. 437. It sounded like it was being spoken by multiple people at once, a chilling chorus from a storm of static. He dismissed it as a bizarre reflection, a radio echo, bouncing off the rock faces in a strange way. The Blue Ridge was notorious for playing tricks with radio waves, but it was the repetition of his badge number that unsettled him. It felt personal, targeted. For the next hour, the transmissions continued intermittently. Each time, it was the same chaotic wash of static and panicked voices, always punctuated by that single, clear element. His number. Following protocol for equipment malfunction, he took out his handheld audio recorder and began to document the bursts, holding the small device up to the speaker of his truck's radio. He recorded over a dozen instances before the phenomenon ceased as abruptly as it had begun, leaving the radio once again filled with the familiar, comforting hiss of an open but silent channel. The next day, back at the park headquarters, Ben filed a maintenance request for his radio system. He mentioned the strange transmissions to his supervisor, who nodded knowingly and spoke of sunspots and atmospheric ducting, offering a dozen plausible explanations. But Ben couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He took the audio cassette from his recorder to the park's communications technician, a man named Gary who had an encyclopedic knowledge of the park's history. He asked Gary to listen to the tape to see if he could make any sense of the noise. Gary put on a pair of oversized headphones and listened intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. After a few minutes, he held up a hand, rewound the tape, and listened again. "That's weird," he said, pulling off the headphones. "The quality is terrible, but some of those phrases, they sound familiar." For the next several hours, the two men worked. Gary used audio filtering software to clean up the recordings, isolating fragments of speech from the overwhelming static. What they uncovered was deeply disturbing. The panicked voices weren't random noise. They were snippets of actual emergency calls. One fragment was a breathless report of a hiker with a broken leg near Black Rock Summit. Another was a frantic call about a car fire near the Thornton Gap entrance. Piece by piece, they matched the fragments to old incident reports. The hiker call was from 1982. The car fire was from 1974. They identified 7 distinct emergency transmissions, the oldest dating back to a report of a lost child in 1968. They were ghosts on the airwaves, echoes of tragedies and emergencies from decades past, all layered on top of each other in a single, horrifying broadcast. But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. The parts of the transmission where his badge number, 437, was spoken were not from any past call. The audio quality of those specific words was different, clearer, as if they were being generated from a separate source and woven into the fabric of the static. There was no record of his badge number ever being part of any historical emergency. Dispatch confirmed again that no one had been trying to reach him that night. The radio hadn't been broadcasting his number. It had been receiving it from some unknown place. The Shenandoah National Park Ranger log from July of 1999 contains a brief entry about radio interference and a submitted maintenance request. It offers a rational explanation of atmospheric conditions. But Ben Carter knew what he heard. He had listened to a phantom broadcast, a collage of past suffering that had somehow reached across the years to find him, to call his name out in the lonely dark of the mountains. He never patrolled that stretch of Skyline Drive at night again without a knot of ice in his stomach, forever listening to the static between transmissions, wondering what other voices were trapped in the air, waiting for the right conditions to speak. The mine shaft gate. Marcus Thorne was a man who believed in rules, regulations, and the unyielding laws of physics. As a safety inspector for the Mine Safety and Health Administration, or MSHA, his world was one of concrete data, air quality readings, geological stress reports, and the tensile strength of steel. He spent his days in the hills of eastern Kentucky, ensuring that the tombs of old coal mines were properly sealed, their deadly gases and unstable depths locked away from the world. He was methodical, meticulous, and not prone to flights of fancy. The job was to prevent disasters, and he did it well. In March of 2014, he was assigned a routine inspection of the old Blackwood No. 3 mine, a shaft that had been sealed for nearly 40 years. The file indicated it was closed due to a catastrophic flood, and the entrance was capped with a 2-ton steel and concrete gate, the standard procedure for permanent closure. His task was simple: check the integrity of the seal, take some atmospheric readings from the vent pipes, and file his report. It should have taken less than an hour. When he arrived at the site, a forgotten notch in a hillside overgrown with kudzu and poplar trees, something was immediately and profoundly wrong. The steel gate, a massive plate an inch thick and cross-braced with I-beams, was bent. It wasn't just dented, it was warped, twisted outward from the center as if a colossal force from inside the mine had tried to push its way out. The concrete around the frame was spiderwebbed with cracks, and the heavy locking bolts were sheared clean off. Marcus stood there for a long moment, his rational mind struggling to process what he was seeing. A gas explosion? Methane could do it, but the vent pipes were clear and designed to prevent that kind of pressure buildup. A geological shift? The surrounding hillside showed no signs of a slide or an earthquake. It looked for all the world like someone or something had simply pushed the gate open from the inside. He cautiously approached the opening, a dark, jagged maw that smelled of damp earth and something else, something vaguely metallic and sour. He unclipped his multi-gas monitor from his belt and held it into the gap. He expected to see high concentrations of methane, carbon monoxide, or a dangerous lack of oxygen. Instead, the monitor beeped with a reading that was almost unbelievable. The oxygen level was 20.9%, exactly the same as the fresh air he was breathing. Fresh air was flowing out of the sealed mine. That was impossible. A 40-year-old shaft should be a pocket of dead, toxic air. He called it in, his voice betraying a hint of the unease that was now solidifying in his gut. His supervisor told him to wait for a geological team, but Marcus's curiosity, his need for a logical explanation, was too strong. He donned his hard hat, clipped on a high-intensity lamp, and stepped through the mangled opening. The air inside was cool and strangely clean. The floor of the tunnel was covered in a thick layer of fine gray dust, undisturbed for decades. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket that muffled the sound of his own breathing. His lamp cut a sharp white cone through the darkness, revealing the timber supports of the old shaft, slick with moisture but still intact. And then he saw the tracks. In the center of the undisturbed dust, there was a set of prints. They were not from a boot or any animal he could recognize. They were just two large, flat impressions, side by side, as if something incredibly heavy had been standing there. Leading away from the impressions was a trail, but it wasn't footprints. It was two parallel drag marks, as if the creator of the first impressions had simply pushed itself forward through the dust without lifting its feet. The trail led deeper into the mine, a pair of shallow furrows in the gray powder. Marcus followed them, his light held out in front of him like a sword. The furrows were perfectly straight, unwavering. He walked for what he estimated was about 20 feet, his boots the only thing making a sound in the profound stillness. Then, the trail simply ended. The two furrows stopped abruptly in the middle of the tunnel. There were no marks beyond that point. The dust ahead was as smooth and untouched as it had been at the entrance. It was as if whatever made the tracks had simply vanished into thin air. He stood there, his mind racing through possibilities and finding none. He swept his light across the walls, the ceiling, the floor. There was nothing. No side tunnels, no collapses, no holes, just the end of the trail. A cold dread, colder than the subterranean air, washed over him. He was standing in a place that defied the rules of his world. He backed away slowly, his eyes fixed on the point where the tracks disappeared, half expecting the dust to stir again. He didn't turn his back on the darkness until he was outside in the daylight, the twisted steel of the gate looking even more menacing in the bright sun. The geological team arrived 2 hours later. They ran seismic scans and sent a camera drone into the shaft. The scans showed no instability, no pressure, pockets. The drone footage showed exactly what Marcus had seen: a straight tunnel, a layer of dust, and a trail that led for 20 feet and then stopped. There was no explanation. The official MSHA inspection record, dated March 2014, is a dry and technical document. It notes a structural failure of the primary seal due to undetermined geological pressure, and recommends a new, more heavily reinforced closure. It makes no mention of impossible atmospheric readings or a trail in the dust that led nowhere. But Marcus Thorne remembers. He remembers the feeling of the clean, cold air pouring from a place that should have been dead. He remembers the sight of those tracks vanishing into nothing. He no longer believes that all laws are written in the books of physics. Some are written in the dark, in the dust, and are not meant to be understood. The flooded hollow, Gary Wilson had spent 30 years with the Tennessee Department of Transportation, and most of that time was spent patching asphalt on the winding back roads of Carter County. He was a man who knew the landscape intimately, not as a scenic vista, but as a constant battle against subsidence, erosion, and the relentless Appalachian weather. He knew every culvert, every drainage ditch, every place where a spring rain could turn a quiet road into a river. The hollows and hills held few surprises for him, until a damp morning in April of 2007. He was driving his county truck down Hatcher's Mill Road, a narrow strip of blacktop that snaked through a deep, wooded valley, when he saw the water. It wasn't a trickle, it was a torrent, a brown, churning sheet pouring from a large concrete culvert and flowing directly across the road. Gary pulled over, annoyed. This culvert, he knew for a fact, was supposed to be dry. It was a spillway for a small catchment pond that had silted up and dried out years ago. The county maps even designated it as inactive. Yet here it was, disgorging thousands of gallons of muddy water onto his pavement. He radioed it in, reporting a blocked culvert and a road obstruction. He assumed a beaver had dammed it up somewhere, or that a sudden spring had burst from the hillside, a common enough occurrence in the region's karst terrain. The explanation was simple. The solution, routine. A pump crew would arrive, they'd drain the water, clear the blockage, and move on. The pump crew arrived within the hour, 2 men with a large trailer-mounted diesel pump. They dropped the intake hose into the churning water on the upstream side of the culvert and fired up the engine. For hours, the pump roared, spewing a high-pressure jet of water into the woods on the far side of the road. Slowly, painstakingly, the water level began to drop. Gary watched, sipping coffee from his thermos, expecting to see a tangle of logs and beaver-chewed branches emerge. But what the receding water revealed was not wood. It was metal. The rusted, mud-caked roof of a car. Then another. As the water level fell further, the full, impossible scene came into view. The catchment area behind the culvert was filled with vehicles. They were stacked on top of each other, crammed into the small hollow in a chaotic pile of rusted steel and broken glass. There were at least a dozen of them, maybe more. They were old models, sedans and pickup trucks from the 70s and 80s, all covered in a thick layer of silt and algae, as if they had been submerged for decades. The pump crew shut off their engine, the sudden silence ringing in the hollow. The 3 men stared at the automotive graveyard, a discovery that had turned a routine drainage job into a potential crime scene. The sheriff was called. Deputies arrived, and soon the hollow was crawling with officials. They ran the license plates and vehicle identification numbers of the cars they could access. The results only deepened the mystery. None of the vehicles were listed on any stolen car reports. They weren't linked to any missing persons cases. According to the records, these cars simply didn't exist in any criminal database. They were ghosts. The strangest part was the location. Hatcher's Mill Road was remote, but not impassable. How could a dozen cars have been dumped in this one small hollow without anyone noticing? And where had all the water come from? There was no stream, no river, just the culvert that was now, inexplicably, a fountain. The work order for the pump crew was to clear the water, and so they continued. They pumped all day and into the evening, the water level dropping foot by foot, revealing more of the silent, rusting wrecks. They decided to leave a smaller, automatic pump running overnight and return in the morning with heavy equipment to begin the process of pulling the cars out. Gary went home that night with the bizarre image of the car pile seared into his mind. He lay awake for hours, trying to piece together a rational explanation and failing. The next morning, he drove out to the site before his shift started, curious to see the progress. He rounded the final bend in Hatcher's Mill Road and pulled to a stop, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing. The hollow was dry, not just drained, but bone dry. The automatic pump sat on a bed of damp mud, its engine silent. The pile of cars was gone, all of them. There were no tire tracks from wreckers, no signs of heavy machinery. The ground where the automotive graveyard had been was now just a muddy depression, empty except for a few scattered rust-colored stains. The culvert was silent. The torrent of water had stopped. Looking inside, Gary could see nothing but dry concrete and a few damp leaves. It was as if the entire event, the flood, the cars, the investigation, had never happened. He called the sheriff's office. The deputy who had been on site the day before was confused. He remembered the call, the cars, the eerie lack of records. He drove out to meet Gary, and together they stood at the edge of the empty Chech Hollow. There was no evidence, no proof, just the memory of an impossible sight. The official Tennessee DOT work order from April 2007 is marked as completed. It states that a temporary blockage in Culvert 7B on Hatcher's Mill Road was cleared. It makes no mention of a dozen phantom vehicles that appeared in a sudden flood and vanished in the night. For Gary Wilson, the hollows and hills are no longer predictable. He knows that sometimes the earth itself decides to show you what it has buried, and sometimes, just as quickly, it decides to take it back. The mill clock Eleanor Vance was a woman in love with the past. As a volunteer archivist for the Rowan County Historic Preservation Society in North Carolina, she found her purpose in the quiet, dusty spaces of forgotten buildings. Her current project was the Cannon Textile Mill, a vast brick behemoth that had once been the lifeblood of the town of Salisbury, before falling silent in the late 1970s. For months, Eleanor had been carefully cataloging old documents, photographs, and machinery, breathing life back into the mill's story. Her favorite part of the structure was the clock tower, a proud, four-sided spire that rose above the sprawling complex. The clock faces were weathered and missing their hands, and the bell, according to all records, had been removed and melted down for a scrap drive during World War II. The tower was a silent monument to a time when the entire town had moved to the rhythm of its chimes. In September of 1995, on a cool, clear evening, the silent tower spoke. Eleanor was working late in the old foreman's office, organizing payroll ledgers under the glow of a single desk lamp. The rest of the mill was a cavern of darkness and silence. It was exactly midnight when she heard it. A deep, resonant chime. Bong. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. It seemed to come from the very bones of the building. A vibration she felt in the floorboards as much as she heard with her ears. Bong. A second chime followed, then a third, counting out the hour. She froze, her hands hovering over the brittle pages of a ledger. Her first thought was that it must be a church bell from town, the sound carrying on the night air. But this was different. It was deeper, richer, and it was close. It was inside the mill. She sat perfectly still and counted along. 9, 10, 11, 12. After the 12th chime faded into the oppressive silence, she was left with a racing heart and a profound sense of disbelief. The tower had no bell. She had been up there herself. The belfry was an empty space of rotting timbers and pigeon nests. She tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was the sound of a train on the nearby tracks, the clang of wheels on a switch echoing through the large, empty building in a strange way. Maybe the temperature change was causing the huge steel beams of the structure to contract, producing a percussive bell-like sound. She packed up her things, her hands unsteady, and locked the office. As she walked through the cavernous spinning room, the moonlight slanting through the tall, grime-covered windows, the vast space felt different. It was no longer just empty. It felt expectant, as if it was holding its breath. The next day, she mentioned the incident to the head of the Preservation Society, a practical man named Mr. Abernathy. He was dismissive, blaming the acoustics of the old building and her overactive imagination. Undeterred, Eleanor spoke to the security company that monitored the mill. They had a basic audio monitoring system designed to pick up the sound of breaking glass or forced entry. She asked them to review the recordings from the previous night. specifically around midnight. The security guard she spoke to was reluctant, but he eventually agreed. He called her back an hour later, his voice stripped of its earlier boredom. "Ma'am," he said, "I don't know what to tell you. We've got it. 12 chimes, clear as day, starting right at midnight." He explained that the sound was strange. It didn't have a clear point of origin like a breaking window. Instead, it seemed to reverberate through the entire structure at once, picked up by every microphone in the facility simultaneously. He emailed her the audio file. Eleanor listened to it on her computer, the sound tinny through the small speakers, but undeniably the same deep, resonant chime she had heard. It was real. That evening, driven by a need to understand, she went back to the mill, this time with a high-quality audio recorder. She set it up on a tripod in the center of the main floor, directly beneath the clock tower, and sat in her car in the parking lot to wait. The minutes leading up to midnight crawled by. At 11:59, she held her breath. The clock on her dashboard flipped to 12:01. Silence. Nothing happened. Disappointed and feeling a little foolish, she waited another 15 minutes before going inside to retrieve her equipment. As she entered the mill, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. On the floor, directly under the center of the tower, was a fine sifting of dust and debris, a small circle of grit on the concrete. She looked up. The ceiling 4 stories above was a web of shadows, but she had the distinct impression that the dust had been shaken loose from the beams. It was as if something up there had been struck with immense force, a silent impact whose only evidence was the sound it had made the night before, and the dust that now lay at her feet. She packed her recorder and left, the mystery deeper than ever. The chimes were never heard again. The Historic Preservation Society memo from September 1995 only briefly mentions a review of the security system audio, with no conclusive findings. But Eleanor Vance knows what she heard. She believes that for one night, for 12 brief moments, the heart of the mill began to beat again. It was a clock with no bell, ringing out a time that had long since passed, a memory of industry so powerful it could shake the very dust from the rafters and echo into the present. The switchback bus. Martin Gable was a school bus driver of the old school. For 30 years, he had driven the winding, treacherous roads of Boone County, West Virginia, with a steady hand and an unblemished record. His bus, number 17, was his domain, and the children on his route were his responsibility. He knew every pothole, every blind curve, every family along the remote hollows he served. His internal clock was set to the school bell, and his movements were as predictable as the rising sun. This reputation for reliability made the events of November 14, 2011, all the more baffling and terrifying. It was a cold, gray afternoon. A damp chill hung in the air, and the mountains were shrouded in a thick fog that clung to the trees. Martin was on his final run of the day, dropping off the last dozen elementary school students along the Switchback Mountain route. The trip was uneventful. The kids were boisterous, their chatter filling the bus as he navigated the familiar turns. He made each stop, called out each name, and watched as each small figure disappeared into the mist toward their homes. He finished the route, as always, at the turnaround at the top of the ridge and headed back to the county depot. When he arrived, the transportation supervisor, a stern woman named Janice, was waiting for him, her arms crossed and her face a mask of worry. "Martin," she said, her voice tight. "Where are the kids from the switchback route?" Martin stared at her, confused. "What do you mean?" I dropped them all off. Same as always. Janice shook her head. We've had a dozen calls. Panicked parents. None of the kids from Switchback Mountain ever made it home. A cold dread washed over Martin. It was a driver's worst nightmare. He insisted he had completed his route, that he had watched every child get off the bus. Janice led him to the dispatch office. The GPS tracker on bus 17 showed his route, a perfect, unbroken line covering every designated stop, completed at the correct times. According to the data, he had done his job perfectly. But the children were missing. The sheriff was called, and a frantic search began. Deputies and volunteers fanned out across the mountain, their flashlights cutting feeble beams through the oppressive fog. Martin was questioned for hours. He recounted every detail of the trip, every stop, every child's name. His story never wavered. He was a man adrift in a nightmare, his 30 years of perfect service crumbling around him. The investigators checked the bus's onboard security camera, hoping for a clue. But the system had malfunctioned. The recording from the afternoon run was a corrupted file, nothing but static and garbled noise. It was another dead end. As dusk settled into a deep, impenetrable night, the situation grew more desperate. The search parties found nothing. No footprints, no dropped backpacks, no sign of the 12 missing children. The parents gathered at the small community fire hall at the base of the mountain, their faces etched with terror. Then, just after 9 p.m., nearly 5 hours after they should have been home, the first child walked out of the woods and into the fire hall's parking lot. He was cold and his clothes were damp, but he was unharmed. Over the next hour, the others appeared, emerging from the fog in small groups, all safe. The relief was overwhelming, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. The children's stories were strangely consistent and deeply unsettling. They all said they had gotten home on the bus. They said Mr. Gable had let them off at their normal stops. But then they described the ride. They said the bus was quiet, that Mr. Gable hadn't spoken a word. They said the windows were all fogged over, so they couldn't see outside. And when they got off, they weren't at their homes. They were standing on an old, overgrown dirt road they didn't recognize, deep in the woods. The bus, they said, just drove away into the fog. They had spent hours walking together, following a creek until they heard the sirens and saw the lights of the fire hall. They were all adamant about one detail. The bus that dropped them off in the woods wasn't their normal bus. It was another bus, one little girl kept repeating. It looked like bus 17, but it wasn't. Martin Gable was eventually cleared, though the incident cast a long shadow over his career. The official explanation, documented in the county school's transportation log from November 2011, was a combination of a GPS glitch, a camera malfunction, and a case of mass confusion among the children, likely disoriented by the thick fog. But Martin knows what he did. He knows he drove his route and dropped his students at their homes. And 12 children know what they experienced. They rode a silent, phantom bus that looked like number 17 but wasn't. A bus that took them not to their houses, but to a place lost in the woods, leaving them to find their own way back from a journey they were never supposed to take. The TVA tower Samuel Keene was a lineman for the Tennessee Valley Authority, and he understood power. He understood the hum of high-voltage lines, the immense, invisible river of electricity that flowed through the steel towers, crisscrossing the landscape. He was comfortable 100 feet in the air, trusting his safety harness and his years of experience. He worked in a world of absolutes, currents, voltages, and closed circuits. It was a world that made sense. In the winter of 1984, near the sprawling, secretive complex of Oak Ridge, that world of absolutes was fractured by an event that defied every principle he knew. Sam was part of a crew tasked with running diagnostics on the main grid. A cold snap had put a heavy strain on the system, and they were hunting for phantom loads, unexplained power draws that indicated a fault somewhere in the network. For days, they had been chasing a significant anomaly, a massive and intermittent drain that was appearing and disappearing from the grid with no clear source. Late one afternoon, huddled in a monitoring truck, they finally pinpointed it. The power was being drawn from a decommissioned substation, designated Substation 7. Sam knew the place. It was an old feeder station from the Manhattan Project era, taken offline in the 60s. Its cables had been physically severed from the main transmission towers years ago. It was an island, electrically isolated from the grid. Yet, the monitors were showing it pulling down several megawatts of power, enough to light up a small town. The readings were impossible. Sam's foreman, a man named Henderson, cursed and looked at the schematics. "There's no connection," he muttered, tracing the lines with a calloused finger. "There's nothing there to draw power." He dispatched Sam to the substation to do a visual inspection, assuming a sensor malfunction or a faulty reading. Sam drove his utility truck down a series of old, poorly maintained access roads, the skeletal forms of the transmission towers marching alongside him. The substation was in a clearing, surrounded by a high chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. The place was a relic, the transformers and switchgear coated in rust and grime. A sign on the gate, faded and peeling, warned of high voltage, a threat that should have been hollow for 20 years. But as Sam got out of his truck, he heard something that made him freeze. A low, powerful hum. It was the sound of active, high-voltage equipment, a sound as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. It was coming from inside the fenced-in yard. He approached the gate, his boots crunching on the frozen gravel. The air itself felt charged, electric. He could feel the static raising the hairs on his skin. He looked at the massive ceramic insulators on the towers overhead, the points where the thick transmission cables had once connected the substation to the grid. The cables were gone. There were just the bare, severed connection points, open to the air. Yet, the transformers were humming with power. Through the fence, he could see the lights on the control panels inside the small, brick relay house glowing. They were on. He walked the perimeter of the fence, his mind struggling to find a rational explanation. A hidden line? A backup generator? He saw no evidence of either. The only conduits leading into the substation were the massive, disconnected overhead lines. It was as if the station were drawing power directly out of the air. He radioed Henderson. "You're not going to believe this," he said, his voice strained. "It's hot. The whole yard is energized." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Sam, that's not possible. Stay clear of the fence. We're coming to you." While he waited, Sam watched the substation, a place that should have been cold and dead, but was instead thrumming with an inexplicable energy. The hum was constant, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate in his chest. As dusk began to fall, the glowing lights inside the relay house seemed to grow brighter, casting an eerie green light through the grimy windows. The crew arrived, just as it was getting dark. Henderson and two other linemen stood with Sam, staring in disbelief at the humming, glowing ghost of a power station. They used a handheld EMF meter, which shrieked with a high reading the moment it was pointed at the fence. The place was saturated with an electromagnetic field, but there was no source. Then, as they stood there in the cold, watching and wondering, the hum just stopped. The lights in the relay house flickered and died. The charged feeling in the air vanished. The substation went silent, once again becoming a cold, dead relic in the woods. Back at the monitoring truck, the phantom load had disappeared from the grid as suddenly as it had appeared. The event was logged and debated for weeks. Engineers pored over the old schematics, searching for a forgotten connection or a bizarre inductance phenomenon. They found nothing. The substation was inspected from top to bottom and was confirmed to be completely disconnected from any power source. The final TVA maintenance record from February 1984 is brief and inconclusive. It documents an unexplained phantom load event and attributes it to a probable metering system error. The log, however, still showed the kilowatt hours. Power had been consumed. It had been drawn from the grid and sent to a place with no connection, used for a purpose no one could identify. And then it had vanished. Sam Keen never forgot the sound of that hum, the impossible energy pouring into a dead place. He knew that for a few hours on a cold winter day, a ghost machine had woken up, and for reasons unknown, demanded its share of the power that flowed like a river through the Tennessee hills. The foggy overlook, Clara Mae Thompson had owned the Black Bear Ridge Lodge, a rustic little inn just off the Blue Ridge Parkway, for 35 years. She was a practical, no-nonsense woman who had seen her share of strange things in the mountains, from sudden, violent storms to the eerie silence of a deep winter snow. She wasn't easily rattled. But the complaints that started in October of 2008 were different. They were quiet, persistent, and deeply unsettling. It began with a couple from Ohio, guests who had stayed in one of the cabins with a view of the nearby Raven's Roost overlook. They checked out early, their faces pale and drawn. "We couldn't sleep," the husband said, his voice low. All night long, there were headlights, a car, just circling the overlook, around and around. The lights kept sweeping across our window. Clara Mae was puzzled. The overlook was closed after dark, and the park rangers were diligent about clearing it out. She assumed it was just some late-night joyriders. She apologized to the couple and thought nothing more of it. But a few nights later, another guest, a lone hiker staying in the main lodge, reported the same thing. "It was the strangest thing," he said over breakfast. "Like a car was trapped up there, just driving in slow, silent circles. I watched for an hour. No sound, just the lights." This time, Clara Mae called the Park Service. The ranger who took the call was polite but skeptical. He promised to have the night patrol swing by the overlook more frequently. The reports, however, continued. Nearly every guest with a view of the overlook mentioned the phantom headlights. The story was always the same. A single set of lights, appearing after midnight, circling the small paved loop of the overlook endlessly and silently. Each time a complaint came in, the rangers were called. Each time, they found the overlook completely empty. There were no cars, no people, no sound. Just the thick, rolling fog that so often blanketed the high peaks at night. Frustrated and determined to get to the bottom of it, Clara Mae started watching herself. She would sit in the darkened lobby of the lodge, a pair of binoculars to her eyes, and stare at the overlook a quarter-mile away. On the first clear night, she saw nothing. The overlook was an empty patch of darkness, but on the third night, when the fog rolled in thick and white, she saw them. 2 points of light, soft and diffuse in the mist, moving in a slow, steady circle. They appeared from nowhere, completed a lazy loop, and vanished back into the fog, only to reappear moments later to begin the circuit again. There was no engine noise, no crunch of tires on gravel, just the silent, hypnotic dance of the lights. She watched for 2 hours, a cold knot of fear tightening in her stomach. The next morning, as soon as the sun was up, she drove to the overlook herself. She expected to find something, anything to explain what she had seen. Tire tracks, maybe an oil slick. The pavement was damp with dew, but it was otherwise clean. Then she noticed them. In the soft earth at the edge of the asphalt, there were fresh tire marks, a single set, tracing a perfect circle around the perimeter of the overlook. They looked freshly pressed into the mud, as if a car had just driven there. She called the sheriff this time, and a deputy came out. He looked at the tracks, looked at the empty overlook, and shrugged. "Probably just kids, ma'am," he said. "They come up here late, do a few donuts, and take off when they hear a car coming." But Clara May knew that wasn't right. The tracks weren't the frantic scuffs of a car doing donuts. They were precise, deliberate, a perfect, continuous loop. And they didn't explain the silence or the way the lights appeared and disappeared into the fog. The phenomenon became a local legend, a ghost story whispered among the staff at the lodge. Guests would take pictures of the overlook at night, hoping to capture the phantom lights. Their photos always came back, showing nothing but a blank, white wall of fog. The official Parkway visitor complaint log from October 2008 records several entries regarding unconfirmed reports of late-night vehicle activity at Raven's Roost Overlook. Each entry is followed by a note from the Park Service stating that patrols found the area clear. The rational explanation offered was that the heavy fog, combined with reflective dew on the trees, was likely refracting distant lights from the valley below, creating the illusion of movement. But Clara May Thompson knows what she saw. She knows the difference between a reflection and a pair of headlights. And on foggy nights, she still looks out toward the overlook, and sometimes she still sees the silent, circling lights, a lonely traveler on a road to nowhere, forever tracing a path on the edge of the world. The mining camp ledger. Kevin Shaw was a history graduate student with a passion for the forgotten corners of the past. He was spending the summer of 1992 as an intern for the Eastern Kentucky Historical Society, a dream job that involved sifting through boxes of brittle documents in a climate-controlled basement. His task was to digitize the records of the Red Ash Mining Company, a coal operation that had gone bust during the Great Depression. It was tedious work, scanning payroll ledgers, supply manifests, and union disputes. But Kevin found a quiet joy in piecing together the lives of the miners from the faded ink. One afternoon, while cross-referencing a payroll ledger from 1926 with the official county census records from 1920 and 1930, he found an anomaly. The ledger, a heavy, cloth-bound book, listed the names and pay rates for over 200 men. As he typed the names into his database, he noticed a pattern. There was a group of about 30 names that appeared on every weekly payroll for the entire year. Yet, they didn't appear in the 1920 census or the 1930 census. It was as if these 30 men had simply appeared in the Red Ash camp for a few years and then vanished without a trace. His curiosity piqued. Kevin started digging deeper. He checked marriage records, birth certificates, and death records for the county. Nothing. He searched the archives of the local newspaper for any mention of these men. Again, nothing. They were ghosts in the records, men who were paid every Saturday but seemed to have no other existence. The payroll ledger itself was strange. The bookkeeper had a neat, consistent hand, but the entries for these 30 specific men were different. The ink was slightly darker, the script a little more cramped, as if written with a different pen or a heavier pressure. They were listed under a separate heading, Deep Seam Crew. Kevin knew from the mine's geological surveys that the deep seam was a notoriously dangerous and unstable vein of coal that the company had tried and failed to exploit. According to the official reports, the section had been abandoned in 1925 after a series of small collapses. Yet, this ledger showed a full crew being paid to work it throughout 1926. He became obsessed with the mystery of the Deep Seam Crew. He theorized they were itinerant workers who had come from out of state, which might explain their absence from local records. To test this, he decided to check the cemetery records. Many mining towns had a simple, company-owned cemetery for workers who died on the job or had no family to claim them. He found the records for the old Red Ash Cemetery and spent a full day going through them, cross-referencing the names of the 30 phantom miners. He found no matches. Not a single man from the Deep Seam Crew was buried there. Defeated, he returned to the archives, his head swimming with questions. Who were these men? Why was there no record of them anywhere except for this one payroll book? He decided the first step was to get high-quality scans of the relevant pages to send to a historical society in a neighboring state to check their records. He pulled the heavy ledger from its archival box and opened it to the pages for 1926, and his blood ran cold. The pages were blank. Not just the names of the Deep Seam Crew, but all the entries for the entire year. The neat columns were still there, the faint blue lines on the yellowed paper, but the ink, the meticulous script of the bookkeeper, was gone. He frantically flipped through the book. The records for 1925 were there. The records for 1927 were there. But the entire section for 1926 was a ghost, the paper pristine and unmarked. He was certain he hadn't imagined it. He had spent days staring at those pages, memorizing the strange, dark ink of the phantom names. He searched his workstation, his notes, the small office. He found the printout from his database, the list of 30 names he had typed himself just a few days before. The list was real, but the source, the physical evidence, had vanished. He went to his supervisor, a dry, academic man who looked at Kevin with a mixture of pity and concern. The supervisor examined the ledger. "Ink fade," he said, with an air of finality. "It happens with these old iron gall inks, especially if the paper has a high acid content. A change in humidity, exposure to light during your work. It can accelerate the process. The ink was probably there, but so faint you were the last person to see it before it disappeared completely." The explanation made a kind of sense, but Kevin didn't believe it. It was too specific, too complete. It wasn't fading. It was erasure. It was as if the ledger had corrected itself, removing a story that was never meant to be read. The official historical archive scan request from May 1992 is still on file. It lists Red Ash Mining Comber Payroll Ledger, 1926, but the attached memo notes that the request could not be fulfilled as the relevant pages were found to be illegible due to severe ink degradation. Kevin Shaw finished his internship and went on to become a history professor, but he never forgot the 30 names on his printout. They were men who had worked and been paid and had existed, if only for a brief time, in the faded ink of a book that later decided to keep its secrets. He understood that some parts of the past don't just fade. They are actively forgotten, erased by forces that guard the line between what is remembered and what must remain buried. The tunnel whistle. Frank Colucci was a railroad man, born and raised. He was a foreman for CSX, and his territory was the rugged, unforgiving terrain of southern West Virginia, where the tracks clung to mountainsides and disappeared into the gaping mouths of old tunnels. He was a practical man, concerned with rail integrity, drainage, and the endless war against rockfalls. He had no time for ghost stories. The Big Bend Tunnel, a dark, dripping bore over a mile long, had been a source of folklore for a century, home to the legend of John Henry. But Frank was interested in the new tunnel that bypassed it, the Great Bend Tunnel. The old one had been officially sealed in the 1970s, its entrances blocked with earth and rubble. In March of 2001, Frank and his crew were working near the eastern portal of the sealed Big Bend Tunnel, replacing a section of track on the main line. It was late afternoon, the sun dipping behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the valley. The work was loud and strenuous, a cacophony of sledgehammers, power wrenches, and shouted commands. During a brief lull, as the men caught their breath, they all heard it. It was a sound that didn't belong. A long, mournful blast from a steam whistle. It was deep and resonant, and it echoed through the valley, seemingly coming from the direction of the sealed tunnel. The men looked at each other, their faces a mixture of confusion and unease. Steam locomotives hadn't run on this line in 50 years. Probably some collector with a historic engine on the tourist line over in Hinton, one of the younger crew members suggested. Frank nodded, but he knew that was a stretch. The Hinton line was 20 miles away, on the other side of a mountain. The sound had been close, too close. They went back to work, the incident momentarily forgotten in the rhythm of their labor. But as the day ended and they were packing their tools, it happened again. The same mournful whistle, a single, sustained blast that seemed to rise from the earth itself. This time, there was no mistaking its origin. It came directly from the blocked entrance of the old tunnel. A shiver ran down Frank's spine. His first thought was vandals. Teenagers, maybe, with a recording and a powerful speaker, playing a prank. Annoyed, he grabbed a powerful flashlight and walked toward the old portal. The entrance was a massive mound of dirt and rock, overgrown with weeds and small trees, just as it had been for 30 years. There was no sign of disturbance, no footprints, no place for anyone to hide. The tunnel was sealed tight. He called the county sheriff, reporting potential trespassers. A deputy arrived and together they inspected the area, finding nothing. The deputy was dismissive, suggesting the sound was an echo from a distant train horn, distorted by the valley's acoustics. Frank knew the difference between a modern diesel horn and an old steam whistle. They weren't the same. The incident bothered him. The next day, he brought a small, motion-activated audio recorder from home. Before his crew started work, he placed the device on a rock near the sealed portal, partially hidden by a bush. He wanted proof. His crew worked all day, and the whistle was not heard again. That evening, before he left, Frank retrieved the recorder. He took it back to his office at the rail yard and plugged it into a speaker. He fast-forwarded through hours of silence, the sound of wind and birds. Then, he found it. At precisely 6 p.m., the time the old crews would have ended their shifts, the recording captured the sound. It was the steam whistle, loud and clear. But that wasn't all. Listening closely, he could hear something else underneath the whistle's blast. It was faint, but it was there. The sound of steel on steel, the rhythmic clang of sledgehammers, and what sounded like men singing an old railroad work song. He felt a profound chill. He was listening to a ghost crew, finishing their day's work inside a mountain that had been their tomb. Determined to find a rational explanation, Frank convinced his superiors to let him bring in a survey team. He told them he was concerned about the stability of the seal. The surveyors used ground-penetrating radar and seismic sensors. Their report was clear. The tunnel behind the seal was completely collapsed about 100 yards in. It was a solid wall of rock and earth. There was no open space for sound to echo from. Yet, the sounds persisted. For the next week, the whistle was heard every evening, always at the same time. The crew grew increasingly spooked, refusing to work past sunset. Frank left sensors at the site for several nights. Each time they recorded the whistle, followed by the faint sounds of a work crew that couldn't possibly be there. The official CSX maintenance log from March 2001 contains a note about unexplained auditory phenomena near the Great Bend Tunnel, attributing it to unusual atmospheric and geological conditions causing acoustic anomalies. The investigation was closed, but Frank Colucci knows what the sensors recorded. He knows that every evening, as the sun sets over the mountains, a shift ends for a crew that never clocked out. The mountain holds them in its dark embrace, and their lonely whistle is a signal to a world that has long since moved on. A mournful cry from a place where time and work never truly ends. The campground lights. Sarah Jenkins had been a seasonal park host at the Elkmont Campground in the Great Smoky Mountains for 5 summers. She loved the job, the quiet rhythm of the forest, the smell of wood smoke, and the satisfaction of helping families experience the beauty of the wilderness. She was organized and observant, qualities that made her good at her job. Elkmont was a popular campground, and in the peak season of July, it was almost always full. The loops were a cheerful jumble of tents, RVs, and the warm glow of campfires and lanterns. In July of 2017, that familiar, comforting glow was replaced by something strange and unsettling. It started with a family at campsite B14. They stopped by her host site on their way out, looking tired and a bit spooked. "We had some noisy neighbors last night," the father said. "Kept us up late. They had their lanterns on all night, shining right into our tent." Sarah was confused. She consulted her registration log. "Sir, the campsite next to you, B15, is vacant. No one has been checked into it for 3 days." The man insisted. "I saw the lights myself, a couple of lanterns glowing through the trees. They were there all night." Sarah walked over to campsite B15 after the family left. It was empty and undisturbed. The fire ring was cold and clean. There were no footprints, no signs of anyone having been there at all. She dismissed it as a reflection. Perhaps the man had seen his own lantern light bouncing off the leaves. But a few nights later, a different camper, a young woman at Site C2, reported the same thing. She said she had seen a soft, yellowish light at the unoccupied site next to her, C3. She described it as looking like an old-fashioned gas lantern and said it had glowed steadily for hours before fading just before dawn. Again, Sarah checked the site. It was empty. The registration logs confirmed it was vacant. Now she was concerned. Over the next 2 weeks, the reports became more frequent, coming from campers all over the different loops of the campground. The story was always the same: a soft, lantern-like glow appearing at a nearby, unoccupied campsite. The light was always silent, never moving, and would persist for hours before disappearing. The rangers were notified. They began making extra patrols through the campground at night. They drove the loops, their flashlights sweeping through the trees, but they never saw the lights. Whenever they arrived at a site that a camper had reported, they found only darkness and silence. The campers, however, continued to see them. One guest, an amateur photographer, managed to take a picture. He showed it to Sarah on the small screen of his digital camera. The photo was mostly dark, but between two trees, where the empty campsite should have been, were two faint, glowing orbs of light. They had no clear source. They just hung there in the darkness, a soft, ethereal yellow. The rangers offered a scientific explanation: bioluminescent fungi, popularly known as foxfire. They explained that certain types of decaying wood in the park could host a fungus that glowed in the dark, creating an eerie light. They said it was a natural, though uncommon, phenomenon. Sarah wanted to believe them. It was a tidy, rational explanation, but it didn't feel right. The light the campers described was too steady, too bright. Foxfire was typically a faint, greenish glow, not the warm, yellow light of a lantern. And it was always at an empty campsite, as if someone was there, waiting in the dark. One night, determined to see it for herself, Sarah stayed up late, sitting on the porch of her small host cabin. Around 2 a.m., a camper from D-Loop came rushing up to her, his eyes wide. "It's happening right now," he whispered. "At D9, the site right across from me." Sarah grabbed her most powerful flashlight and followed the man. As they approached the D-Loop, she saw it. In the center of the dark, empty space of campsite D9, there was a soft, pulsing yellow light. It was about the size and brightness of a Coleman lantern, hanging in the air about 4 feet off the ground. There was no sound, no smoke, no person holding it. It was just there, a silent beacon in the night. She raised her flashlight, her thumb on the switch, but hesitated. There was something about the light that felt private, as if she were intruding on something. She watched it for a long minute, her heart pounding. It glowed with a gentle, steady rhythm, like a slow heartbeat. Then, as if sensing her presence, it simply faded, not winking out, but slowly dimming into nothingness over the course of a few seconds, leaving the campsite in complete darkness. She and the camper stood there, in the silent woods, the only light now coming from the moon filtering through the leaves. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park Ranger Incident Log for July 2017 notes multiple camper reports of unusual lights at Elkmont Campground, with the official conclusion being probable sightings of bioluminescent fungi. But Sarah Jenkins knows what she saw was not fungus. It was a light without a source, a fire without heat. It was a memory of a campsite, a spectral echo of countless campers who had sat in that same spot. She understood that in a place as old as the Smokies, some visitors never truly leave, and they still light their lanterns to keep the deep, ancient darkness at bay. The script mine tokens. Arthur Penhaligon was a man who preferred the company of the past. A retired history teacher, he spent his weekends in the rolling hills of southern Ohio, sweeping his metal detector over the sites of old mining camps and forgotten homesteads. He wasn't looking for treasure. He was looking for stories, for the small, discarded pieces of people's lives. A belt buckle, a mason jar lid, a child's toy. In August of 1998, in a patch of woods near the abandoned settlement of Shawnee, his detector gave off a sharp, clear signal that was different from the usual iron grunt of a rusty nail. He knelt down and carefully dug into the soft, loamy soil. About 6 inches down, his trowel hit something hard. He pulled it out and wiped away the dirt. It was a coin, about the size of a quarter, made of brass. On it were stamped the words Shawnee Coal and Iron Co., and the denomination 25 cents in trade. It was a piece of scrip the private currency mining companies used to pay their workers, redeemable only at the company store. What stunned Arthur was its condition. It was perfect. The brass gleamed as if it had been minted yesterday. There was no tarnish, no corrosion, no sign of the 70 years it should have spent in the acidic Ohio soil. He pocketed the find, thrilled. A piece in that condition was a rare treasure. He continued his search, and a few feet away, he got another signal. He dug again and found another scrip coin, this one for 50 cents, in the same pristine condition. Over the next hour, he found 7 more, all from the Shawnee Coal and Iron Co., all looking brand new. It was the most remarkable find of his career. He marked the spot on his GPS and went home, his mind buzzing. The Shawnee Company had closed in 1929. How could these coins have survived so perfectly? He returned to the same spot the next weekend. As soon as he stepped into the small clearing, his detector started screaming. The ground was littered with signals. For the entire day, he dug. Every hole yielded 1, 2, sometimes 3 scrip coins. He unearthed dozens of them in every denomination, from 1 cent to $1. They all shared the same impossible quality. They were flawless, gleaming in the sunlight as if fresh from the press. By the end of the day, his pouch was heavy with them. He felt a growing sense of unease. This wasn't a lost pocketful of change. This was a trove. It felt wrong, as if he were taking something he shouldn't. The sheer quantity and perfect condition defied any logical explanation of soil chemistry or preservation. It was as if someone had just buried them. But who would bury brand new, 70-year-old coins in the middle of the woods? He decided to take a few of the best examples to the County Historical Society to have them authenticated and recorded. The curator, a woman who had seen her share of amateur finds, was astonished. She confirmed they were authentic Shawnee scrip, but was baffled by their condition. "I've never seen anything like it," she'd said, examining one under a magnifying glass. "It's as if they were sealed in a vacuum. There's not a single pit mark on them." She officially recorded the find in the Society's artifact log, and Arthur went home feeling validated, though the mystery remained. Work and family kept him away from the site for several weeks. When he finally had a free weekend in late September, he returned, eager to see what else the ground held. He navigated to the GPS coordinates and stepped into the clearing. But something was different. The small holes he had dug had been filled in, the earth tamped down and covered with fresh leaves. The entire area looked neat, clean, almost manicured. He switched on his metal detector and began to sweep the area where he had found the coins. Nothing. Not a single beep. He widened his search pattern, sweeping back and forth across the entire clearing and into the surrounding woods. The detector remained silent. The ground that had been saturated with brass targets just weeks before was now completely barren. He spent hours searching, his initial confusion turning to a cold, prickling dread. The coins were gone. Not just the ones he had left, but any trace that they had ever been there. It was as if the earth had been scrubbed clean. He went back to his truck, the woods feeling suddenly alien and watchful. He looked at the few coins he had kept in his collection box. They were still there, solid and real, gleaming under the dome light. They were his only proof. The County Historical Society artifact record from August 1998 documents the accession of 5 pristine Shawnee Coal and Iron Cumber scrip coins. The notes section contains the curator's puzzled observation about their unusual state of preservation. Arthur Penhaligon never found another coin at that site. He came to believe that he had stumbled upon something he wasn't meant to find. Not a lost treasure, but a payment. He had the unsettling feeling that for a brief period, the Shawnee Coal and Iron Comber had reopened its books, and he had been digging up the wages of ghosts, coins left in the earth for a crew that was still on the payroll. The flood sirens. In June of 1986, Daniel Ross was a young city engineer for Huntington, West Virginia, a city that lived under the constant, watchful eye of its massive flood wall. The wall was a concrete shield against the unpredictable fury of the Ohio River, and its sentinels were a network of powerful air raid sirens designed to warn the downtown area of an imminent breach. Daniel's job was to maintain that system, to ensure that the network of relays, timers, and manual activators was always ready. It was a job he took with the utmost seriousness. The sirens were a sacred trust. They were never to be sounded except in a true, verified emergency. On a perfectly clear, sun-drenched Tuesday afternoon, with the river flowing placidly a dozen feet below the top of the levee, every single one of those sirens began to wail. The sound was apocalyptic, a rising and falling shriek that echoed off the buildings and sent a wave of primal fear through the city. People poured out of offices and shops, their faces turned to the sky, expecting to see a funnel cloud, or to the river, expecting to see a wall of water. Daniel was in his office in City Hall when the sound hit. For a moment, he was paralyzed by sheer disbelief. He sprinted to the central control panel, his heart hammering in his chest. The board was a sea of green lights. No automated sensors had been tripped. The river gauges showed normal levels. No emergency had been declared. The only way to activate the system without a sensor trip was a manual override, using a key at one of the 4 remote activation stations located along the flood wall. He got on the Yule radio, his voice frantic, demanding to know who had activated the system. The fire chief, the police chief, the emergency management director, they were all as baffled as he was. No one had given the order. No one had the keys except for a handful of authorized personnel, and all of them were accounted for. As the sirens continued their terrifying cry, the 911 switchboards lit up with panicked calls, and a strange new element was added to the chaos. Dozens of callers, many of them living or working in buildings directly adjacent to the flood wall, were reporting the sound of rushing water. They swore they could hear a roar, like a waterfall or a broken dam, coming from the other side of the concrete barrier. This was impossible. The river was calm. Daniel and a team of police officers raced to the flood wall. As they got closer, the sound of the sirens was deafening, but underneath it, there was nothing. Just the normal, quiet sounds of the city. There was no rushing water. They stood atop the levee and looked down at the Ohio River, placid and serene under the summer sun. Yet, the calls kept coming in. People just a few hundred feet away insisting they could hear a deluge on the other side of the wall. After 15 agonizing minutes, Daniel made the decision to manually shut down the system from the central control. One by one, the sirens spun down into silence, leaving the city in a stunned, ringing quiet. The investigation began immediately. It was a high-priority affair, a terrifying failure of a critical public safety system. The system logs were the first place they looked. The computer recorded every event, every signal, every activation. The log for that day was chilling in its simplicity. It showed that at 2:17 p.m., the system had received an activation signal from Manual Station 3, located near the Harris Riverfront Park. A key had been inserted and turned, but when a police officer was dispatched to Station 3, he found the heavy steel box locked tight, showing no signs of tampering. The lock was inspected and found to be in perfect working order. Only the official, city-issued keys could open it. It was a contradiction, a ghost in the machine. An event had happened that left a digital footprint but no physical evidence. The reports of the phantom flood were dismissed as mass hysteria, a psychological side effect of the terrifying siren blast. But the reports had been too numerous, too consistent. For thousands of people, the sound of the warning had been accompanied by the sound of the disaster itself. The final report from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers system log, dated June 1986, classified the event as an unexplained system activation, likely caused by a transient electrical short or radio frequency interference. It was a technical way of saying they had no idea what happened. But Daniel Ross never accepted that explanation. A short circuit couldn't turn a key in a lock. RF interference couldn't make thousands of people hear a flood that wasn't there. He came to believe that the system hadn't malfunctioned. It had worked perfectly. He believed that for 15 minutes on a clear summer day, the flood wall had held back not a river of water, but a river of time, a memory of a disaster that had not yet happened, or one that had happened in a world just alongside their own. The sirens weren't a false alarm. They were a warning of a ghost tide, a flood that was both real and imaginary, and all the more terrifying for it. The Ridgefire Tower. Henry Gable had a history with the Black Balsam Knob Fire Tower. As a young man in the North Carolina Forestry Service, he had manned it for 2 long, lonely summers, watching for the first wisps of smoke from its cramped, glass-walled cabin. The tower had been decommissioned in the 1970s, replaced by spotter planes and modern technology, and for decades it had stood as a silent, rusting sentinel on the high ridge. Henry, now retired and living in a small house in the valley below, could see the tower from his back porch, a familiar and comforting silhouette against the sky. In September of 2003, on a crisp, moonless night, he saw something that disturbed the quiet peace of his retirement. The lantern in the fire tower was lit. It wasn't a bright light, but a soft, warm yellow glow, exactly like the old kerosene lantern he used to light every evening at dusk. He stared at it for a long time, rubbing his old eyes. He knew for a fact that the tower was derelict. The wooden stairs had rotted away years ago, and the final access ladder had been removed by the Forest Service to keep hikers from climbing it. The cabin at the top was an empty shell, its windows long since shattered by wind and weather. There was no reason for a light to be on. He watched the light for over an hour. It didn't flicker or move. It was a steady, constant glow, a lonely beacon in the immense darkness of the mountains. His first thought was that some adventurous hikers had managed to climb it and had lit a candle. It was dangerous, but plausible. The next morning, he called the local sheriff's department and reported it, expressing his concern about trespassers and fire risk. A deputy promised to drive up the Forest Service road and check it out. The deputy called him back that afternoon. "Henry, we went up there. There's no way anyone's been up in that tower. The first 20 feet of stairs are completely gone. We couldn't even get close. No footprints, no signs of a campfire, nothing." Henry was insistent. "I saw a light, son. I know what I saw." The deputy was patient. "It gets tricky up there at night. Could have been a star, or maybe the lights from the ski resort on the next ridge reflecting off something." Henry knew it wasn't a star. It was a lantern, in the cabin where he had once sat. That night, the light appeared again. Henry called the sheriff's department again, and this time, he convinced the deputy on duty, a young man who knew of Henry's history with the Forest Service, to come to his house and see for himself. The deputy arrived, and together they stood on Henry's porch, looking up at the distant tower. The light was there, a faint but steady pinprick of gold against the black ridge. The deputy saw it too. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "Okay, Henry. We'll go up there first thing in the morning and we'll bring a ladder." The next day, Henry, the deputy, and another officer drove up the winding, rutted road to the base of the fire tower. The structure looked even more dilapidated up close. The steel was streaked with rust, and the tower groaned in the wind. The wooden stairs that led to the first landing were indeed gone, the remaining structure hanging precariously in the air. They used an extension ladder from the sheriff's truck to get to the first steel ladder. The climb was treacherous. Rungs were missing, and the whole tower swayed with their weight. Finally, they reached the trapdoor that led into the cabin. It was rusted shut and secured from the inside with a heavy, iron bolt they could see through a crack. It took them 10 minutes with a pry bar to force it open. The cabin was a scene of utter dereliction. The glass was gone from the windows, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, leaves, and bird droppings. It was clear no one had been inside for a very, very long time. In the center of the room, on the rusted remains of the map table, sat the lantern. It was an old Forest Service model, just like the one Henry remembered. Its glass chimney was cracked and coated with grime. The fuel tank was bone dry and rusted through in several places. There was no wick, no kerosene, no way it could have produced a light. The deputy picked it up, and Henry reached out and touched the glass chimney. It was warm. Not hot, but distinctly, undeniably warm to the touch, despite the cold mountain air blowing through the empty window frames. The three men stood there in the wind-whipped cabin, a silent, shared understanding passing between them. There was no rational explanation for what they had found. The NC Forestry Service patrol note from September 2003 is brief. It mentions responding to a civilian report of a light at the Black Balsam Tower, and concludes that the investigation found no evidence of trespass or fire, suggesting the report was a probable reflection from a distant light source. But Henry Gable knows the truth. He knows the feel of a warm lantern glass on a cold morning. He believes that some duties don't end with retirement or decommissioning. On some nights, when the darkness in the mountains is absolute, a lone watchman still climbs the rotten stairs of a forgotten tower to light his lamp, forever standing guard over the forest he called home. The flooded asylum. For the maintenance crew of Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, the old Hillview State Hospital was a problem that wouldn't go away. Closed in the late 1980s, the sprawling asylum was a monument of brick and slate, slowly surrendering to the elements. The county's job was to keep it from collapsing entirely, which mostly meant patching the roof and keeping the basement pumps running. The sub-basement, a labyrinth of old storage rooms and steam tunnels, was prone to flooding from a high water table, and a network of automated sump pumps was all that kept it from turning into a lake. In January of 1990, during a week of bitter cold and freezing rain, a pump alarm from Hillview went off at the Central Facilities office. It was 3 a.m. The alarm indicated a critical failure. Pump number 4 in the sub-basement was offline, and the water level sensor was reporting 12 feet of water. It was a full-scale flood. The on-call maintenance man, a veteran named George Stanwyck, got the call. He bundled up against the cold, grabbed his tools, and drove the county truck out to the abandoned hospital. The place was even more menacing at night, its dark, empty windows like vacant eyes staring out into the freezing rain. He let himself in through a service entrance, the sound of his boots echoing in the vast, silent hallways. He made his way to the sub-basement, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the thick, musty air. He expected to hear the gush of water, to step into a flooded corridor. But as he descended the final concrete steps, he was met with silence. The floor was bone dry. He walked through the corridors, his light playing over the damp-streaked walls and piles of forgotten debris. He made his way to the pump room. The concrete floor was dusty. Pumps 1, 2, and 3 were silent but functional. Pump number 4 was dead, its motor cold to the touch, but there was no water. Not a puddle. The sump pit itself was barely damp at the bottom. He checked the water level sensor, a sophisticated ultrasonic device mounted on the ceiling. It was what had sent the alarm. According to its blinking red light, the room he was standing in was currently under 12 feet of icy water. He radioed his supervisor, Tom, who was monitoring the system from the central office. "Tom, I'm down here in the pump room," George said. "It's dry as a bone. The sensor must be on the fritz." "That's impossible, George." Tom's voice crackled back. "I'm looking at the live feed from the sensor right now. It's giving a steady reading. 12 feet, 2 inches. The system diagnostics all say the sensor is functioning perfectly." George stood there, confused, in a perfectly dry room that the entire county monitoring system insisted was flooded. "Well, tell the computer it's wrong," George said, "because I'm standing right where the deep end should be." He set about trying to reboot the faulty sensor, but nothing worked. It stubbornly continued to report a flood that wasn't there. Then he started to hear something else, a sound that the radio couldn't pick up. Dripping. It was a slow, steady, rhythmic dripping sound, but it seemed to be coming from everywhere, at once. It echoed strangely in the concrete room, making it impossible to pinpoint the source. He checked the pipes overhead. They were all dry. The ceiling was intact. Yet the sound of dripping water persisted, a maddening, constant rhythm in the silent basement. He decided to check the audio monitors. In addition to the water sensors, the county had installed a few microphones in the sub-basement, a low-cost way to listen for the sound of burst pipes or vandals. He walked to a junction box on the wall and plugged in his headset, tapping into the live feed from the microphone in that very room. He put the headphones on, and the sound that filled his ears made him rip them off in shock. It wasn't the gentle dripping he was hearing in the air. It was a cacophony, the sound of a torrential flood, of gushing, churning water, of voices screaming and shouting, muffled as if they were underwater. It was a wall of terrifying, chaotic sound, and it was supposedly coming from the microphone hanging 5 feet away from him, in the silent, empty room. He stood there for a long moment, the faint, real-world dripping sound, a counterpoint to the memory of the scream-filled flood in his ears. The air in the room grew heavy, and a deep, penetrating cold settled into his bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the winter night outside. He couldn't fix the sensor, and he couldn't explain the sounds. He decided to tag the whole system for replacement and get out. He locked up the asylum, the dripping sound seeming to follow him all the way to the exit. Back at the office, the sensor for pump room 4 continued to report 12 feet of water for another 3 hours, before it suddenly, and for no reason, returned to a normal reading of 0. The audio monitors recorded only silence. The Allegheny County Facilities maintenance log from January 1990 has an entry describing a malfunction of ultrasonic sensor unit 4B at the Hillview facility, resulting in false positive readings. It recommends a full system replacement. It does not mention the phantom sounds of a flood, nor the screams of the drowning. George Stanwyck never volunteered for a late-night call at the old asylum again. He understood that some places are haunted not by ghosts, but by events. He had stood in the dry memory of a flood, a tragedy that had happened, or was yet to happen, and whose echo was still screaming to be heard in the dark, silent heart of the abandoned hospital. The Quarry Echo. For the teenagers of Augusta County, Virginia, the old limestone quarry was the unofficial heart of summer. Its deep, cool, turquoise water was a magnet on hot August days. Dylan Price, at 19, was in his third summer as a lifeguard there. He took the job seriously, his eyes constantly scanning the water from his elevated chair, his posture a study in practiced vigilance. He knew the quarry's moods, its sudden cold spots, its treacherous ledges. He also knew the echoes. Shouting a name across the wide expanse of water would send it bouncing back from the sheer rock faces, distorted and strange. It was a game the younger kids loved to play. One sweltering evening in August of 2015, as the sun began to set and the quarry was closing, the familiar echoes took on a chilling new character. Most of the swimmers had left, but a small group of regulars was still packing up on the far side of the water. Dylan was getting ready to make his final sweep when he saw one of the kids, a boy named Leo, run up to his parents, looking scared. Dylan watched as the parents looked around, then back at their son, shaking their heads. A few minutes later, as the family was walking toward the exit, the father stopped by Dylan's chair. "Hey," the man said, "you guys doing some kind of late-night roll call or something?" Dylan was confused. "No, sir, we're closed." "Weird," the man said, glancing back at the darkening water. "We kept hearing a voice from the other side, from that cliff over there. Sounded like it was coming from a megaphone. It was calling out names." A shiver went down Dylan's spine. "What names?" "Local names, I guess. Miller, Hensley, Shiflett. Just a list of names, over and over. Gave my kid the creeps." After the family left, Dylan was alone. The quarry was silent, the water a dark, placid mirror reflecting the bruised purple sky. The stillness was profound. He tried to rationalize what the man had said. It had to be kids, hiding in the woods on the other side, playing a prank with a bullhorn. Annoyed that he would have to file an incident report, he keyed the small radio on his hip. "This is Dylan at the quarry. I've got some possible trespassers on the North Ridge. Could you send a car to check it out?" Dispatch acknowledged the call. As he waited, he scanned the far cliff face with his binoculars. He saw nothing but rock and scrub pine. Then he heard it himself. A voice. It was faint, tinny, and strangely distorted, just as the man had described. It sounded like it was coming from a great distance, yet it was clear. Patterson. The name hung in the still air for a moment before fading, then another. Fitzgerald. It was a calm, methodical voice, like someone reading from a list. It was undeniably coming from the rock face across the water. Dylan raised his radio again, his hand trembling slightly. "Dispatch, I can confirm. I hear the voice. It's still calling out names." He decided to record it. He pulled out his smartphone and started a voice memo, holding it up in the direction of the sound. The voice continued its ghostly roll call. Campbell, Reeves, Weaver. They were all old family names from the area, names he saw on mailboxes along the country roads every day. A sheriff's deputy arrived 20 minutes later. By then, the voice had fallen silent. Together, they drove around to the North Ridge and searched the area for an hour. They found no one. There were no fresh footprints, no discarded cans, no sign that anyone had been there. The deputy was skeptical, suggesting it was an echo from a distant PA system, perhaps from the high school football field 5 miles away. Dylan knew that was impossible. The names were too clear, the source too specific. Back at the lifeguard shack, he played the recording for the deputy. The sound was there, but it was garbled, buried under a layer of static. Yet, the names were just barely audible, a ghostly whisper on the tape. The deputy just shrugged, officially logging the call as unfounded. Dylan was haunted by the incident. He asked some of the old-timers in town about the quarry. One of them, a man whose grandfather had worked there when it was still active, told him a story. He said that, back in the 1920s, before the quarry was allowed to flood, there had been a catastrophic dynamite accident. A whole crew of men, working on the north face, had been buried in a rock slide. Their bodies were never recovered. The company went bankrupt, and the quarry was abandoned, eventually filling with water. The old man said they never even had a proper memorial for the men who died. They were just lost. Dylan went to the county library and spent an afternoon scrolling through microfilm of the old local newspaper. He found it. An article from 1927 detailing the quarry tragedy. It listed the names of the 12 men who had been lost in the slide. He compared the list from the newspaper to the names he remembered hearing, the names on his distorted recording. Miller, Hensley, Shiflett, Patterson. They were all there. The official Augusta County Sheriff audio transcript from August 2015 is attached to an incident report that was closed with no further action. The transcript notes, unintelligible vocal sounds recorded on civilian device, likely radio interference, or acoustic anomaly. But Dylan Price knows he was not hearing an echo. He was hearing a roll call. He believes that every evening, as the last of the swimmers leave and the quarry falls silent, a long-dead foreman still calls out the names of his crew, a final accounting for the men the mountain took, their only memorial, a mournful echo across the water. The Timber Road Convoy. In the mountains of western North Carolina, the logging roads are a private, hidden world. They are unpaved, unnamed, and unforgiving. Temporary arteries carved into the steep hillsides for the sole purpose of hauling out timber. Mike Jensen had been driving these roads for 15 years. He knew how to handle a fully loaded rig on a 12% grade in the rain, how to read the settling of the roadbed, how to anticipate the washout around the next blind curve. He was a professional, steady and reliable. One foggy morning in February of 2007, his professional world was invaded by something that had no place on his maps or in his experience. He was on a solo run, hauling a full load of poplar down from a high-elevation clear-cut. The fog was thick as cotton, reducing visibility to less than 100 feet. It was slow, careful work, his headlights cutting a weak yellow tunnel through the dense gray. According to the company dispatch log, his was the only truck on that mountain, the only one scheduled on that particular haul road until the afternoon shift. As he came around a sharp switchback, he saw them. Taillights. 3 sets of them, glowing red in the fog ahead of him. He was immediately annoyed. It had to be poachers or some joyriders in their 4x4s, trespassing on the company's private road. He slowed down, keeping a safe distance, expecting them to pull over. But they didn't. They maintained a steady speed, their taillights a constant presence in the swirling mist. He tried to raise them on his CB radio. "Hey, you three four-wheelers ahead of the log truck on the Balsam Hall Road, you need to pull over and let me pass. This road ain't for you." There was no response, just the crackle of static. He tried again, his voice harder this time. Again, nothing. For the next 5 miles, he followed the Phantom convoy. They navigated the treacherous road with an unnerving skill, their speed never varying, their formation perfect. Mike grew more and more puzzled. They weren't four-wheel drive pickups. The silhouette he could occasionally glimpse in the fog was wrong. They were big, heavy trucks, just like his. But that was impossible. The dispatch log was clear. No other company trucks were scheduled. He thought perhaps a rival logging company was illegally using their road, a rare but not unheard of offense. He decided to get their license plates. He eased his rig closer to the last truck, its twin red lights hypnotic in the fog. He squinted, trying to make out the plate, but it was either caked in mud or simply not there. The truck itself was strange. It was an older model, a design he hadn't seen in years, with a rounded cab and tall, thin exhaust stacks. All three of them were identical. The road ahead straightened out for a quarter-mile stretch before entering another series of blind curves. Mike watched as the three trucks in front of him continued down the straightaway and disappeared one by one around the first curve. He took the opportunity to speed up a little, planning to catch them on the next straight section. He rounded the curve, his eyes fixed on the spot where they should have been. The road was empty. He slowed to a crawl, then stopped, his air brakes hissing in the sudden, profound silence. The trucks were gone. There were no turnoffs, no side roads, just a steep, impassable drop-off on one side of the road and a sheer rock face on the other. There was nowhere they could have gone. They had simply vanished. He sat there for a full 5 minutes, the fog pressing in around his cab, a cold sweat beading on his forehead. He got out of his truck and walked the section of road where they had disappeared. There were his own tire tracks in the damp red clay of the roadbed. But there were no other tracks. None. It was as if the three trucks had been floating above the ground. Shaken, he got back in his rig and continued his descent, driving faster than he should have, desperate to get back to the paved roads and the familiar world. When he got back to the company yard, he immediately went to the dispatcher's office and demanded to see the logs again. The dispatcher confirmed it. He had been the only driver on Balsam Road that morning. He then asked to see the GPS playback from his truck's onboard unit. The dispatcher brought it up on the screen. It showed Mike's truck, a small icon, moving down the mountain. And there, right in front of him, were three other icons, unlabeled and unidentified, moving in perfect convoy. The dispatcher stared at the screen, his mouth open. The playback showed Mike's truck following the three Phantoms for over 5 miles. Then, at the blind curve, the three icons in front of him simply blinked out of existence. The logging company GPS log from February 2007 was saved as a system anomaly file. The official explanation was a ghost signal, a temporary glitch in the satellite system that had created 3 phantom icons on the map. But Mike Jensen knows that a GPS glitch can't produce taillights. He knows what he saw in the fog. He had followed a spectral convoy down a lonely mountain road, a crew of ghost drivers still hauling a load that was logged and loaded in a year long since past. He never drove that road in the fog again. The hospital annex. In the spring of 1983, a construction crew was tasked with a major renovation, of the Pike County Community Hospital in eastern Kentucky. The project involved gutting the old original wing of the hospital to modernize it. Frank Miller was the foreman of that crew, a man who had spent his life reading blueprints and turning them into reality. He was a practical man who believed in solid foundations and straight lines. The hospital's archives had provided them with the original blueprints from the 1940s to help them understand the building's core structure. One rainy afternoon, while going over the plans in the makeshift office on site, one of his younger crew members pointed out something odd. "Hey Frank," he said, "look at this. The basement plan shows a whole other wing here, an annex, but there's nothing there but a brick wall." Frank looked at the blueprint. The young man was right. The detailed architectural drawing clearly showed a long corridor extending from the main basement, leading to a series of small rooms labeled Isolation Ward Annex. But on the actual site, that part of the basement was a solid, windowless brick wall that appeared to be part of the original foundation. Frank dismissed it as a canceled plan. It was common in old construction projects for features to be designed but never built. The blueprint was probably a preliminary draft, not the final as-built version. Still, it was strange. The annex was drawn with the same level of detail as the rest of the hospital. Driven by curiosity, Frank and his crew took a closer look at the brick wall in the basement. It was old, but the mortar seemed slightly different from the surrounding foundation. On a hunch, he had his men take sledgehammers to it. After a few powerful blows, the bricks crumbled, revealing not solid earth, but a dark, empty space behind them. They had broken through into a hidden corridor. The air that billowed out was stale and cold, carrying a faint, antiseptic smell. They shone their work lights into the opening. It was the annex from the blueprints. A long, narrow hallway stretched into the darkness, lined with heavy steel doors. They had discovered a forgotten, sealed-off wing of the hospital. The discovery brought the renovation to a halt. Hospital administrators and county officials were called in. No one on the current staff had any knowledge of the annex. There was no mention of it in any public records. It was as if it had been deliberately erased from the hospital's history. Frank and a county building inspector were the first to officially enter. The annex was a time capsule. The small rooms were bare, each containing only a rusted iron bed frame and a single high window blocked with bricks. The walls were padded with a thick, horsehair-like material. The air was thick with a profound sense of misery. In the last room at the end of the hall, they found a small, metal desk. On it lay a single, leather-bound physician's logbook, covered in a thick layer of dust. The inspector carefully opened it. The pages were filled with handwritten notes in a spidery script, detailing the treatments of patients in the isolation ward. The notes were chilling, describing experimental therapies for severe psychiatric disorders. The last entry was dated October 1948. It simply read, "Annex sealed. God help us." The existence of this unrecorded and disturbing annex was a major problem for the county. A decision was made to properly seal it and amend the renovation plans to work around it. Before they did, Frank, wanting a record of their discovery, sent a formal request to the county building permit office for a copy of the original blueprints they were working from, specifically the basement plan showing the annex. He wanted an official copy for his project files. The next day, a courier delivered a fresh set of blueprints from the county archives. Frank unrolled the basement plan, the same sheet he had been studying for weeks. He looked for the annex. It was gone. The blueprint now showed a solid foundation wall, exactly as the official record should have been. The corridor, the rooms, the labels, they had all vanished from the drawing. He stared at the paper, his mind reeling. He called his young crewman over, the one who had first noticed the annex. "Am I crazy?" Frank asked, his voice low. "Or was there a whole other wing right here on this plan yesterday?" The young man stared at the blueprint, his face pale. "It was there, Frank. I saw it. We all saw it." Frank rushed to his on-site office. The original set of blueprints he had been using, the ones with the annex, were gone from his desk. He searched the entire trailer, but they had vanished. It was as if the building itself was actively trying to forget its own dark secrets, erasing not just the physical entrance, but the very memory of it on paper. The Pike County Building Permit Office memo from April 1983 acknowledges a request for blueprints for the hospital renovation, but makes no mention of any discrepancies in the plans. Frank Miller's crew sealed the entrance to the annex with concrete and steel, entombing it once more, but Frank never forgot. He knew that for a brief time, he had stood in a place that history had tried to erase, a place of forgotten suffering so profound that it could even reach out and change the records that proved it ever existed. The Appalachian Trail Shelter. For thru hikers on the Appalachian Trail, shelter logbooks are a cherished tradition. They are a combination of a diary, a message board, and a lifeline filled with trail names, weather reports, warnings about bears, and words of encouragement. Jacob "Jake" Emerson, a solo hiker from Ohio, was 2 months into his northbound journey when he reached the Overmountain Shelter near Roan Mountain, a converted barn famous for its stunning views. He arrived at dusk in early September of 2018, tired and hungry, his muscles aching from a long day's climb. The shelter was empty, and he was grateful for the solitude. After making dinner, he settled onto one of the wooden sleeping platforms and pulled out the shelter's logbook to make his entry. It was a thick, spiral-bound notebook, its pages filled with the familiar scrawl of countless hikers. He wrote his entry in his neat, practiced print. September 12th, 2018. Trail name, Pacer Jake. Arrived at dusk, trail was good but tough. Got the whole place to myself tonight. Headed for Damascus tomorrow. Happy trails. He closed the book, satisfied, and tucked it back into its waterproof container. The sun had set, and a deep, star-filled night settled over the mountains. The only sound was the wind whispering through the high meadows. As he was getting into his sleeping bag, a sudden, nagging curiosity made him pull the logbook out again. He had a strange impulse to see who the last hiker to come through before him was. He opened the book to his entry. Then he turned the page to look at the next one. And his heart stopped. The next page, the one that should have been blank, was already filled out. The entry was written in a messy, hurried script that looked eerily like his own. It read, September 13th, 2018, trail name, Pacer Jake. Made a mistake coming here. Shouldn't have stayed. The fog is wrong. Something is on the trail behind me. It's following me. Can't stop. Jake stared at the page, his blood turning to ice. The date was for tomorrow. The name was his. The handwriting was a distorted, panicked version of his own. His first thought was that it was a prank. It had to be. Some other hiker with a twisted sense of humor must have seen his pack, guessed his trail name, and written a fake entry to spook him. But how? The shelter had been empty when he arrived. And the handwriting? It was so close to his, down to the way he looped his J's and crossed his T's. It was his writing, but filled with a terror he had never known. A deep, primal fear began to creep in. The vast, empty shelter suddenly felt claustrophobic. The sound of the wind outside no longer sounded like a whisper. It sounded like a footstep. He took out his phone, his hands shaking, and took a clear photograph of the logbook, with both his own entry and the terrifying future one visible. He needed proof that he wasn't going crazy. He didn't sleep that night. He sat with his back against the wall, his headlamp on, listening to every creak and groan of the old barn, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. He kept thinking about the words. Something is on the trail behind me. At the first hint of dawn, he packed his gear in a frantic hurry. He didn't make coffee, didn't eat. He just had to get away from that shelter. Before he left, he looked at the logbook one last time. He opened it to the page. His entry from the previous night was there, but the next page was blank. The terrifying message from the future was gone. The paper was clean, empty, waiting for the next hiker. He half ran down the trail, constantly looking over his shoulder, the words from the vanished entry echoing in his mind. The fog rolled in, thick and disorienting, just as the entry had predicted. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He felt hunted. He hiked for 12 straight hours, not stopping until he reached the next town, his nerves completely frayed. When he finally got cell service, he told his story to a friend who convinced him to report it to the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. He sent them the photograph he had taken. The response he got was polite but dismissive. They said shelter logs were often vandalized or filled with trail magic jokes by other hikers. They thanked him for the report and wished him well on his journey. The official Appalachian Trail Shelter logbook from the Overmountain Shelter for September 2018 shows nothing out of the ordinary. An entry from Pacer Jake on the 12th, and another from a hiker named Wanderslow on the 14th. The 13th is blank, but Jake Emerson has the photograph. It's a digital ghost, proof of a warning from a future that never happened, or perhaps one that he narrowly avoided. He finished his hike, but the experience changed him. He understood that on a trail that old, a path walked by thousands of souls, sometimes you don't just follow the footsteps of those who came before. Sometimes, if you're not careful, you might just cross paths with the person you are about to become. The power plant siren, Mark Corbin, liked the quiet. It was the main reason he took the midnight security shift at the Summersville Dam, a massive concrete behemoth holding back the Gauley River in West Virginia. At night, the visitor center was empty, the engineers were home, and the only sounds were the distant hum of the turbines deep within the dam's belly and the gentle lapping of the lake against the concrete. It was a peaceful, solitary existence, watching over a sleeping giant. In the deep cold of January 2004, that peace was shattered by a sound that should not have existed. Mark was on his patrol, walking the long, open expanse of the dam's service road. The night was still and frigid, the air so cold it hurt to breathe. Suddenly, a siren erupted from the direction of the power plant's intake tunnels. It wasn't the dam's main emergency siren, the one designed to warn the valley below of a catastrophic failure. This was a different sound, a high-pitched, piercing shriek, like an industrial alarm. It blasted for 10 seconds and then abruptly cut off, leaving an echoing silence that was more profound than before. Mark's heart was pounding. He immediately radioed the plant's 24-hour control room, located deep underground. Control? This is Corbin at topside. Did you just trigger an alarm at the intake? The voice of the on-duty engineer, a calm veteran named Dave, came back, unconcerned. "Negative, Mark. All systems are green down here. Didn't hear a thing." "Dave, I'm telling you, I heard a siren," Mark insisted. "Loud and clear. It came from the intake structure." "Probably just an ice fracture," Dave said, his voice placating. "The cold can make the metal up there sing a pretty tune. We're not showing any alarms on our end." Mark knew it wasn't ice. It was a siren, an alarm. He walked over to the intake structure, a massive concrete tower that rose from the lake, connected to the dam by a walkway. This was where the water entered the huge penstock tunnels that fed the turbines. He shone his flashlight over the structure. Everything looked normal. There were no flashing lights, no signs of distress. He felt a growing unease. An hour later, it happened again. The same piercing shriek, 10 seconds long, echoing across the frozen lake. He called Dave again, his voice more urgent this time. "It happened again, Dave. Same alarm." This time, Dave was less dismissive. 2 reports were not a fluke. He checked the system logs. "Mark, I've got nothing. No triggered alarms, no pressure drops, no system failures. The entire plant is running smooth as glass." But Mark had another tool. As part of a recent upgrade, the Army Corps of Engineers had installed a series of decibel monitors at various points on the dam to track noise pollution and structural acoustics. Mark had access to the data feed in his security booth. He went back inside and pulled up the log for the monitor located right above the intake tunnels. His blood ran cold. The log showed 2 distinct acoustic events, precisely at the times he had heard the siren. Both events registered at 110 decibels, a sound level equivalent to a live rock concert or a jet engine. The system had recorded a deafening sound that the engineers, sealed in their control room, had neither triggered nor heard. The most chilling part was what happened next. Mark called Dave and told him what the decibel meter had recorded. Intrigued and now officially concerned, Dave pulled the audio recordings from the maintenance tapes that corresponded with the time of the decibel spikes. These tapes were a secondary system, designed to help engineers diagnose mechanical problems by listening to the sounds of the machinery. He fast-forwarded to the first event and listened. Nothing. He played the tape from the second event. Again, nothing but the low, steady hum of the turbines. The decibel monitors had recorded a massive sound event, but the audio recorders, located in the exact same area, had picked up only silence. It was a physical impossibility. A sound that was loud enough to be logged by a sensor but left no trace on an audio recording. It was a sound that had physical presence but no audible substance. The final Army Corps of Engineers incident note from January 2004 is a study in bureaucratic ambiguity. It logs an unexplained acoustic anomaly registered by Decibel Monitor 7, but notes that audio recording analysis was inconclusive. The suggested cause is a potential sympathetic resonance in the penstock tunnels due to unusual water flow and temperature gradients. Mark Corbin doesn't believe in sympathetic resonance. He believes that for 10 seconds, twice in one night, an alarm had sounded from a place that wasn't quite inside the dam. It was a warning system for a different set of rules. A siren screaming about a pressure or a presence that our instruments were never designed to detect. He finished his shift that night, feeling like a very small man standing on a very large, hollow structure. And he never again trusted the quiet.